Welcome, everybody. I am thrilled to have people here for this talk. Not for myself or 350 Bay Area, but for the topic, which I think is an existential, fascinating, and extremely crucial topic of our times. The title we have today is Climate Crisis, Trumping Fear with Action and Changing the System. People in activist circles have surely heard the phrase change the system, or not climate change, systems change. And that's my angle today, is systemic change. The climate crisis is a catalyst for social change. Briefly about me, my name is Jennifer Wells. I specialize and have focused my career on sustainability, now called flourishing or transitioning, or sometimes surviving. I am a transdisciplinary scholar in humanities, critical social theory, and environmental issues. A professor in the Bay Area, an author, and right now a speaker for one of my favorite organizations in the world, Bay Area 350. A great talk has no more than 3 topics, but I'm a rule breaker. So, oh, yes, next, sorry. So I have 5, but I think they'll flow nicely together. The first is climate updates, and I will touch on the very basics of climate science, but I think in this audience we have a pretty good grounding. This is not 1980 or even 2007, but 2017, so I'll focus on just a few key updates on the climate science. Then I'll talk about fear, which is also a catchword for a whole host of emotions that come up when we talk about truly deep existential crises. The third topic is systems change, using the phrase also web of life. Many of our greatest, most pioneering thinkers in the last century have focused on these 2 terms. And if we haven't fully succeeded in integrating that message yet, that doesn't mean that we aren't making a lot of progress in that area. Thirdly, we'll focus on action. So if the issues are systemic, if the problems are systemic, and if the solutions are systemic, then we'll look at levers in systems, systemic levers for change. And these are just a few obvious examples: renewable energies, the UN Climate Conference of Parties process, 21 and 22. It's a very large mayors movement, over 1,000 mayors just in the US. The Divest, Reinvest movement, carbon taxes, and last but most important, the social movements that fuel all of the above. And finally, we'll zoom in a little bit on the Bay Area, which is one of the epicenters of pioneering change. Yet another reason to engage with this incredible topic. So climate updates, first of all. So we don't need to go into all the grisly details. Let's reframe and reboot a little bit from the ways that the discourse that we've had and the ways that we've talked about it over the years. If we think about the massive carbon emissions going into the air every day around the world, unprecedented, and an extreme amount of greenhouse gas emissions, one way to think about it is in terms of 2 or 3 sources, and this helps us get at the systemic issues behind it. So on the one hand, as we know, the extremely wealthy and the power structures around them are responsible for a huge percentage of that overall carbon budget. So CEOs of huge corporations, the millionaires and billionaires, as Saunders called it, the billionaire class, if you look at the breakdown of all the carbon emissions, it's over 80% from a very, very small group of people. Then there's extreme poverty. And I've spent a lot of time working in human rights in third world countries, and you see every day on the front line of third world countries that people are chopping down trees not because they want to spend 5 hours with a tiny little handsaw chopping a branch off, but because they have to cook dinner that night. So, you know, the middle class and the middle classes in their state today obviously are all part of this webby system that needs systemic change. The very basics: the heat, the rays from the sun come into this atmospheric layer. Some of the rays will bounce back out. Some will be held on the Earth's surface in that atmospheric layer, in the surface of the Earth and the oceans. And the more greenhouse gases there are in this layer, the more stays trapped. We've all seen this for years, hopefully. This is the basic chart showing that this is an anomaly and an extreme situation, that over a long period of history, it's been within and up a certain range, going up and down, but we're now far above that range. This chart to me brings it even more home. This is a chart showing the 10 hottest years since 1998. 1998 was the year that I really got kind of grabbed by the neck and realized I have to, I can't avoid this anymore. 1998 was a very hot year, and 20% of the ocean's corals were bleached in that summer. And if you look at this, you see, one of my specialties is complex systems analysis with critical social theory involved. And if you look at this, you see a nonlinear curve. It means that in nature, very few things are linear. Many things behave in a nonlinear way. And the last 5 years are all near over here. And these are the last 3 years, 2014, 2015, and 2016. So it's kind of taking off in terms of global average temperature. Who is emitting what? This is one portrayal of who's emitting what. And this is the 90 companies that are producing, manufacturing, selling the fossil fuels that are cooking the planet. The circles are big in relation to the percentage, the amount. So ExxonMobil is the biggest, with Chevron, BP's, a few others coming in after Shell, Saudi Aramco. One of the messages that we've gotten over time is that on the one hand, it's attractive and interesting and easy to think about how this is related to our everyday lives. So there's a great temptation to look at the local and to look at the individual, because that we have a lot of agency. We can do that. We can do that in our own home. And we may even be able to get solar panels in our home and get a Nissan Leaf and what have you. But part of what these last couple charts show is that this individualistic, piecemeal approach, as I think we're starting to get the message out, is vastly insufficient when we think about what we said at the beginning about 80% of emissions coming from, and the number is just 3,000 entities in the world. So that includes who? Who are those 3,000 entities is the crucial piece of information. And it's these companies, but it's states, it's governments. The US government has massive fleets of cars and trains and planes and buildings, and this adds up to a tremendous amount. So this is like everything with systemic issues. This is the bad news and it's the good news, right? And right now I know the next few years are not looking so hot, but I think I'm going to persuade you today that there are a few outliers and there is a massive amount of majority in the world who are interested in action. We need to shift from individualistic and local level to institutional and systemic. That doesn't mean giving up the first piece. That's obviously always got to be there too. But that's the comfort zone. And really the challenge for us today is the institutional and systemic issues. But the good news is that this is very interrelated with intersectionality and coalition building. If the issues are systemic, and as it becomes increasingly obvious just how systemic the issues are, then the answers are intersectional and coalitional. And this means not a small coalition, this means a huge coalition, right? I was in a room once in New York City with where Bernice Johnson Reagan was talking, and she said, if you like everybody in the room, the coalition is not big enough. And that is only more true every day. I think that we all feel in this last month of horror from the Orange Menace team, the kind of raw, real energy of the necessity of real coalitions, right? Why do we feel so overwhelmed? Why is cognitive dissonance so massive? This chart, to me, gets at the systemic nature and start to pull apart why is the feeling of overwhelm so great when we shift from the individual to the larger picture. You may have seen, has anyone seen this chart, this kind of chart before? So it's called it refers to what people call the Great Acceleration. The timeline here, I know you can't see it super well, but a brief explanation will help, which is that on the left side of every one of these graphs is the year 1750, and on the far right side is today. So this is about change from 1750 to today. All of the red ones are indicating social, economic, social organization. How do we organize society? So in the middle we have real GDP, the economy. And the economy, not as a separate issue, the economy, but the economy as the way we organize society, politics, space, trees, Wall Street, and everything. So real GDP since 1950, this is 1950 actually to 2000, we see the same nonlinear curve, but we see the same nonlinear curve in every single diagram. This is real GDP, population, energy use, agricultural fertilizer production, telecommunications, transportation, tourism. So in the last 50, 70 years, all of these things have increased astronomically. So when you hear people talk about the problem of population, there's an issue with population, but look at the issue with energy when we think about climate. On the right, we have all the Earth systems trends. The one in the top left is carbon dioxide emissions, nitrous oxide, methane, surface temperature emissions, and it goes on and on. Tropical forest loss and domestication of land, which also often means loss of carbon sink, and kind of a multiplicitous carbon emission process. So, as Bill, as Bill Maher said, the sixth extinction event and mass refugee crises, genocides, neoliberal capitalist global crisis, dying oceans, disappearing forests, small stuff, right? The small stuff. So why is it that we have this existential crisis that's touching every area of all of our lives, and yet so many people are still looking in other directions? And one argument is that once we realize how big it is, this is an opportunity to bring people together. It's okay. So this is a picture of a street flooding, and it's not that big of a deal, right? Streets flood. But the funny thing about this picture is that it's not a storm going on. There's no rain in the sky. It's what's called sunny day flooding. This is actually in Miami, and this is just a normal day during high tide, and the tide is coming up into the streets. So sea levels are rising. In terms of giving some updated statistics, one of the things I want to mention is that just very recently, and I had discussions over years, I was fortunate back one too, with Stephen Schneider and other of our the greatest climate scientists. And the one thing, as I myself as a transdisciplinary scholar really raked through the science, the one thing that a lot of climate scientists didn't always get fast enough and were very conservative about reporting is the speed and the rate. That's the hard piece, that's the hard piece. But the most recent science, climate science, is showing that predictions of sea level rise are, which had been maybe 1 meter by 2100, even the majority consensus of scientists now are saying it looks more like 2 to 3 meters by 2100. And these are very conservative folks. They don't say that lightly. If we think about 3 meters by 2100, what does that mean by 2050? I'm not a scientist, but maybe 1 meter. And that is a big deal. That's a very, very big deal in the lifetime of many of us. So I just want to give one anecdote about this, which is that 1 month ago I was at a retreat for my job, and we meet in Pacifica, which is just down the coast, 15 miles. And this time, for some reason, they gave me a really nice room. I'd never had such a nice room. I was like, what's going on? It was like on the first floor, oceanfront, which I don't know if you've been to Pacifica, but ocean, you don't have to look too far to see the ocean. It's sort of like right there. And so the first night, it was during that huge storm around the time of the inauguration, poetically enough, late January. And the waves, the sea was very turbulent, the surf was very high. The waves actually hit my window at night. I could hear it splashing up. And then when I woke up and opened the curtains in the morning, I looked down in the sand and the rocks came right up and were piled up against the building. And then I heard that, and luckily I'm a super heavy sleeper. I sleep through anything. But two rooms down from me, the wave had actually crashed through the window and flooded the whole floor, and they had to rip out all the carpets. So when I see this picture of Miami now, I'm like, yeah, it's, you know, it's real. This is real. Here's a picture of the Bay Area. And this is a somewhat outdated picture. If you think about what I just said about the climate science that came out just a few weeks ago, about the different rates of change and amount of flooding, they had predicted with 2 degrees warming, and we're already over 1.5, right? That this much of the Bay Area would be flooded. So you can see a lot of Oakland is underwater with the old prediction by 2100. But this is the prediction with 4 degrees warming. To me, it doesn't look that much worse. So for me, the photo doesn't totally work, because I look at it and I kind of go, that wouldn't be that bad. You just get like a little boat and you could, you know, cruise around the shore. And so I think when we look at these kind of images, we have to think through it a little more and think systemically, think in terms of implications and systems. So what does it really mean for this much of Oakland to be underwater?
All of Alameda is underwater.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, so anyone from Alameda in the room, or West Oakland? And a lot of infrastructure. How much do we just spend on the Bay Bridge? Taxpayers? I don't know. I'm not an engineer, but I think, you know, we have to start thinking ahead, especially if we think about a meter by 2050. This is us. Droughts. Food grows where water flows. We've just got through an historic drought in California for years, and living in the cities of Oakland, San Francisco, or neighboring towns, we don't always feel it directly. But if you rake through the news of the full implications, it's pretty extraordinary. I'm just going to go through a few pieces, and none of this is speculative. None of this is about the next 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. Just empirical evidence from the last 15 years. We don't need to worry about any debates about validity of climate science when we focus on the empirical evidence of the last 15 years, okay? And the US Corn Belt droughts from 2006, between 2010 and 2012, the Midwest drought was one of the worst in US history. Texas was hit extremely hard, a huge swath of the interior South. Losses of 30–40% of corn crops. Huge amount of animals had to be slaughtered. Cows and horses, there wasn't enough water. It was too hot. The animals couldn't adapt. In the same years, these same trends were happening all around the world. In Australia, 1995 to 2012, it's called the Millennium Drought. It was long. It was horrific. 66% of crops during a lot of those years was considered normal. So in other words, they just took the level of, you know, what had been historically the amount of crops that they expected to grow, and they just reduced it, so that sometimes when people do reporting, they're reporting from that new number. But the economic losses were astronomical. But this wasn't just in wealthy countries, and it wasn't just in poor countries. If you look around the world, people all over the world were hit hard. Russia, 2010, the hottest in 130 years. Massive drought, massive wildfires, helped trigger you remember the food price increase, which because it was happening in so many places at once, Russia, but also throughout the Horn of Africa, Middle East, triggered the Arab Spring, we could say, or was a major factor leading to protests around food prices. And 2015, 2017 in the Horn of Africa barely made the news in the US. 15 million people in starvation level conditions. Terrifying situation. Next, with storms. We all know about the storms. When people ask, when will climate change really hit? I always think, well, who are you talking about? If you're talking about the, thousands of people that were washed out to sea at Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, for those people, climate change has already hit. And as people say, climate change is not the only cause of a large storm, a massive flooding event, or a Category 5 hurricane, but is a great accelerator and makes the storms bigger. The flooding in Pakistan in 2013, 14, 15, absolutely outside of historical norms. A fifth of people in Pakistan were displaced in 2013 alone, and they had similar flooding levels in 14 and 15. But one of the things I want to drive home here is that there's so much discourse, and rightly so. I mean, part of my main focus has been climate ethics and justice for 15 years, and is the issue driving the UN Conference of Parties negotiations. And so we've had to put forth the message that, that rich people are causing the problem more and poor people are more impacted faster. It's a yes and situation. That's true, and it's important because without justice, the negotiations cannot go forward. But it's false in the sense of giving a false sense of security, I think, to regular Americans. Because the USA has had higher economic losses than any other place in the world. And if you look at the spate of disasters we've faced, it's really, really huge. Droughts, cyclones, hurricanes, snowmageddons, etc. So this is, I know I usually don't use kind of wonky chart-looking chart, but this is, I think, a really great chart for understanding that it's not just about poor and rich. Justice is crucial, and we're all getting impacted. So it didn't quite fit. On the left is just numbers. So this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is number of severe extreme weather events that caused more than $1 billion worth of damage. This is the year 1980. So 1980, there was 3 events, and it caused a $40 billion worth of damage. 40 billion. And that was kind of an average over the 60s, 70s, 80s. And then as we got into the 90s, suddenly, do you remember that year, 1998? That's the year when 20% of the corals in the world had a bleaching event. There was, I think, 11 events, but now we're up to $120 billion. And you can see that in each, you can't quite see, but in each of the last 5 years, it's up over, well over 100 billion. So 2008, there was 11 events, 150 billion. 2011, there was 16 at 220 billion. And over 200 billion is kind of the new norm for the direct economic hits in the US. But that's just counting things in a certain way. Again, have to think about the implications. And yes, climate issues are justice issues. We can never lose sight of that fact. Not only is it what allows or disallows negotiations to take place between people across nations and within towns, but it is also the source of our greatest power and hope, which is building those larger coalitions. And that means accounting for a lot of things, accounting for historical emissions and accounting for the situation today. I'll just try to keep it brief about the emotions so we can get to the more uplifting part of the talk. But I think it's important to acknowledge it, to validate it. I asked my mom recently how she was doing, and she gave me a typical New Yorker answer. She said, oh, you know, in like a very chipper voice, like, you know, some days it's overwhelming anxieties, and other days it's just crushing despair. And because I know her very well, I know she was kidding, that my mom really never succumbs to despair, or not for very long. Only once during W's administration, she moved to Canada by herself for like a month, and then she came back. She missed my dad, so. But these are really tough issues. They are tough issues, and this can and should and must fuel our coalitions. So this sign is my favorite protest sign ever. This comes from a protest that was held in June 2013 in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. There was massive street protests, just millions of people in the streets. And it was stirred up, no doubt, by economic downturn for years, and then sparked specifically by a huge bus ticket price hike, which people who are living in a very, very marginal situation just literally cannot afford. But this saying, so much that it doesn't fit here, for me, it says so much, and it speaks to that chart with all the nonlinear trends. It speaks to one of the few words I know in Portuguese, which is saudade, which, as I understand, there's no translation for in English exactly, and I might botch this if there's any Brazilians in the room, but I think it means something like longing plus sorrow plus sadness mixed together. So I feel very emotional when I see this. It's like longing for a better world, and all the other emotions that go into that. And with social issues, we may feel that acutely. Sometimes people have a gap with environmental issues because there's this terrible heritage in the Western philosophy especially, but it's come from many places, of the separation of subject and object and people and nature, and this failure to remember, always remember that environment is people. Environment is people. Environment is about people. It's a social issue. If systems change, next is overwhelming. If it feels overwhelming in the last 50 years, that's because it is. And I think this is an image to keep in our minds if we think about how to come together, how to work together around issues that matter to us. Action on climate change matters. Action in the Bay Area matters. Showing our really strong, active, inclusive, intersectional coalitions matters, I think, a lot. And I just had to include this. I don't know if anyone saw this image. Did anyone see this? This was like a woman who was expressing saudade and more at the moment that Trump was inaugurated. I'll see if I can get it to play just for a minute. I'm not sure this is going to work or not.
Donald J. Trump is now President of the United States. President Obama for the
what a great honor to be able to introduce for the first time ever anywhere the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald.
The moment of Trump's inauguration, and she just screams. So,
I'm so sorry.
This is a meme that was sort of taken up and distorted by a lot of Breitbart folks, alt-right folks, but I think we need to take back images of expression of really what's going on, because another part of our intellectual heritage, along with this separation of things, is a kind of a clinical, detached way of talking about everything. Obviously, just screaming is not enough. We need to do a lot more than scream, but I think we need to normalize the true magnitude of emotions around us, as people like Joanna Macy's and others have taught us over the years. Social systems, solidarity. Basically, we can't say that climate trumps or displaces other issues. Black Lives Matter is just as important. You can't compare Black Lives Matter and climate change, or anything for that matter, to my mind. However, You can look at them together. So a few things made me happier than when I saw the Black Lives Matter activists in London. Not that they have to only talk about climate change, that would be absurd, but they interrupted the airport service at the small local airport in London. It was a very direct, interesting political message. And they said, the climate crisis is a crisis of racism. And so they're making that coalitional link. It was brilliant. It's extremely important. And it's important for all of us to be kind of open and aware of when people do make links between different things, because otherwise we remain separate, right? So for me, if we keep this in mind, it really helps. So just to recap this part, yes, causes and impacts are extremely differentiated and unequal and unfair, extremely, right? But also, as a complexity person, I'm always looking at how we only have one biosphere. And again, with the Western tradition, there was a lot of false assumptions about separating and controlling and manipulating. So some things, yes, I can control and manipulate, small objects next to me, which gives me an excuse to drink some coffee. However, much of reality is not that way. And two really big things that are not that way are our climate and the water systems of the planet, right? The atmosphere and water molecules, they're not that controllable, as we're rapidly finding out as the ice caps. The Arctic is rapidly melting. There is no techno fix. If someone comes up with one, we'd all be thrilled, but it's not going to happen. So just to recap, the climate crisis, only the poor are hit. No, we have to start to think in terms of everybody's very directly involved in this greater mesh in various ways, differentiated ways, but together. So I think the thing to remember for this next part of the talk is that if the problems are systemic, then the solutions are systemic, and that is an extremely hopeful thing. It's very scary, but it's also extremely hopeful. And there's a lot. So in terms of this big systemic problem, the problem is huge, but we actually have the money and the technology. What am I basing this on? Many years of research and trying to keep up with very rapidly changing research. I was at COP21. I was very involved in lots of meetings, and the projections are very scary. The problem, you can't understate how huge it is because it's on a timeline. And yet we actually have the money and the technology needed. There are only little bits of technology that we don't maybe completely have, and those we're gaining very rapidly. So one of them, for example, is battery storage and large grids for renewable energies. But I have a lot of friends even who are working directly on this, and the progress is astonishing. Where we put research and development matters, and we've made tremendous advances in the last from 2009 to 2015, the advances on solar were phenomenal, and the prices dropped 70% globally. And we largely have China to thank for that. Many places and countries, but China was the absolute leader if you look in terms of dollars and per capita work, etc. So next, we do this one. Yeah, we need a Green New Deal. So that phrase, I think, or others like it, will keep coming back. But we have many angles that we can work on, and many people are already, I'm sure many people in this room. So the world isn't over till it's over. I firmly believe that. I really deeply believe that. When the world's over, it'll be over, but we're not there yet. And as many of our great thought leaders have said, work is a constant struggle. I mean, Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle. Donna Haraway, Staying with the Trouble, two of the most important books in the last few years. They're both about the fact that nothing happens overnight. These are long-term struggles. Yeah, so specific levers, thinking in terms of levers and thinking in terms of all the different dimensions of this. Everywhere in the world, we need to be having renewable energies. We'll talk a little more about that. The global level, the UN climate conference, I personally think it's very important, and that for all it being much less than we need, it was still a massive breakthrough last year in Paris and this year also in Marrakesh. At the state and local level, every single social organization can be part of this change, and to exclude and say only this. I mean, the U.S. military, there's been fits and starts. We're at the Oakland Peace Center. I'm actually more of a pacifist, and that 50% of our tax dollars, we can keep that, our sights on that 50% of all our tax dollars, and yet, if you look at the data, there has been pushes and some advances in having the existing structures go solar, go renewable. It's small, but we can work on all levels. So I'm going to break it down for the purposes of discussion here on 3 sets of systemic cyclical actions that we can be aware of, and that there are many ways to engage with. So one is the divestment movement. There's lots we could say about it. It has been very powerfully symbolic and has made a huge influence in many ways. And among other things, it's been symbolic and powerful to the financial industry around the world. It's not just activists who are talking about divestment. People who have their money and their life wrapped up in stock markets are very interested in the divestment movement and what's called the financial carbon bubble, which is expected to be the largest in history. When the stranded assets from a lot of these pipelines are stranded, it will be quite huge. So many people are interested in this from very different angles. We have the opportunity to think about stopping subsidies to very rich oil companies and giving money back to people. This isn't totally pie in the sky. This has been elaborated and thought out and worked out by a lot of different people. So, and there are places in the world, Denmark, that are doing projects just like this, basic minimum income for everybody. Even Alaska, all people who live in Alaska get monies from the oil production there. Everybody gets a stipend. So it's not pie in the sky. We need to think in terms of these things. Carbon tax on producers and consumers, and again, giving money back to people like us in this room. I'm sure a lot of you wouldn't mind having a little extra pocket money so that when your energy bill goes up, you'll have more money to pay for it. Thinking systemically. So I tried to, but this is the divest, reinvest. This is good. Takes us to, I think we're in another dimension, Start to think in a multi-dimensional way. So divest, reinvest. So I tried to sort of picture this to make it easier for us. So I start up here, divest from oil, gas, coal, tar sands, all fossil fuels. Invest in renewable energy, solar, wind, hydro, thermal. This is massive, and I think it really pays to go research a little bit and find out just how huge this has been. Once we do this, it helps to support and form locally owned and managed renewable energies. Again, there's many concrete examples around the world. One of them is there's a lot in China, there's in Germany, specifically over 800 towns shifted to renewable energy grids, and at the same time they decided this is our opportunity. We're going to deprivatize and have public ownership so we can have local control. Granted, that hadn't been privatized that long there, so it didn't seem like an illusion to them. But now over 800 towns, including some towns as large as Hamburg, Germany, the citizens of that town actually own their own local renewable energy grid, and they're managing it themselves. It's a better system, I think, my 2 cents. That also can locally strengthen agency and democracy, which can lead to helping build local renewable jobs, renewable energy jobs, and other jobs. It's wonderful to think in terms of these systems so that you see that even your small actions can really be amplified. I'll just briefly say one of the projects I'm involved with Bay Area 350 is SF Clean Power, or Clean Power SF, which is it's an extraordinary program because it's doing just that. It's taking subsidies that were going for other things and instead subsidizing a chance to transition to renewable energy. So anyone in this room, if you are on PG&E, you can switch over. You'll automatically get 10% more renewable energies, and it'll actually, I think, cost you a little less. So there's a lot of incentives going on to get this going, and just takes a little engagement and research to tap into these things. So next one I have is, you've all heard this before, polluter pays. And I put polluter pays, but then we don't always think about pays who. And so polluter pays the public. So if we manage to get carbon taxes on rich corporations, and again, this is happening in piecemeal ways in different places. This is not pie in the sky. Thousands of people are working diligently on this. This helps corporations be incentivized to conserve, get solar or wind. Also, funds from carbon taxes can be paid back out to the public, again, can locally strengthen agency and democracy and build the new green society that we need. I know this isn't easy. You know, I see some people looking a little bit like, but this is happening in various places. I'll give you one more example of where it's happening. In Uruguay, did anyone hear this story? Uruguay, okay, granted it's a relatively small society, but they had some people on board at every level in that nation, and in meaning that the government was interested as well. And they managed to transition from, I'm not sure exactly how much, but presumably a fairly low amount, 5-10%, use of renewable energy in their overall portfolio, to over 93%. And they're at over 93% as a nation, the whole nation, renewable energies. This is not fluffy stuff. This is very real, and it's happening in many places. Again, look at how much China's doing. And the last thing I'll say about this is to look at, if you're interested in the polluter pays the public, go back and look at the Sanders-Boxer's bill and reread that from 2013. Bernie Sanders and Barbara Boxer wrote a bill called the Climate Protection Act. Okay, it didn't go through. It's a beautiful piece of legislation. It's worth reading, and it's very, very empowering just to even see what they're asking for. It's basically this. They're basically asking to get this cycle going. Subsidies reversed. So we often hear about perverse subsidies, but the problem is we've been hearing about it for years, and they're still there. But there are currently massive subsidies going to these oil and fossil fuel companies. Massive, at the federal level, at the state level. And if we can reverse the subsidies, then again, it can incentivize businesses and any entities to switch to renewable energies. And then again, funds from subsidies can go to green infrastructures. So this again is a very positive kind of potential spiral. And there are examples, again, of places where people are reversing this. So, just to remind ourselves that this is very real. Real? Yes, these are real places. The one on the upper left is Portland, Oregon, which is one of many towns in the US that has already achieved a considerable percentage of renewable energies in their mix, over 30%. I think it's over 33%. Oakland's doing pretty well. San Jose is doing great. So there's lots of towns around in California that are where a lot of different people working together are making this happen very quickly. This picture here is of an extraordinary place called Curitiba, Brazil. And if you don't know that one, that's another one to go look up and read about. It's a very inspiring story. And one of the things I love about the story of Curitiba, which has gone very high renewable, it's a very green city, is that they're financially poor. They really didn't have a lot of money. So they made the energy transition from fossil fuels to renewable, clean, zero-emission buses, et cetera, on a very low budget. And yet it's a beautiful city with beautiful buildings, and there are animals roaming around the center of the city around huge lakes. I mean, I think any of us might like to live there. So, but we could maybe create it here. This one is Uruguay. That example I just mentioned, over 93% renewable energies. And this one, I have to emphasize, is China. If you look at the data, China has been the world leader. And one reason that I'm so up on China right now is because in Marrakesh, after all the talk, because Marrakesh was COP22, happened at the same time as the US elections. So there was a lot of everybody was talking about, what does this mean? They just elected this, orange agent, this Agent Orange. What is this going to do? And China has stated very loudly and publicly that in the event of the U.S. pulling funds out of the Paris Climate Accord, and actually Trump's talking about pulling all U.S. funds, or as much as he can get away with, out of the UN system generally, like 40% or something. It's absurd. China has already said, that's okay. We're going to stay in the accord. We're going to take the leader of the mantle of leadership, and the rest of the world, and even some of the small oil states, are not pulling out of the Paris Accord. So we are the only outlier, which is very good news. Can't guarantee that it's going to keep on, but. So renewable energies, who wants renewable energies? That's kind of an absurd question. Who doesn't want renewable energies? I mean, how many people would really prefer to throw up hundreds of mirrors into space, or start to do geological experiments with the entire planet, knowing how flawed our epistemology and our knowledge system is? It's utterly absurd. I think anyone, if you ask them, would you rather turn down the sun or put a solar panel in your house? I think it's kind of a no-brainer. And the thing to keep in mind is really the vast majority of the people in the world are already engaged in this in one way or another. At some point, go to the 350.org website, and there's archives of photos from events in countries all around the world and cities all around the United States. This is a picture of a protest in India, and there's been mass mobilization there. Indians are smart; they get it. This is the heat wave a couple years ago, killed tens of thousands of people. This is a very immediate issue, but it's not just people all over the world. It's also, this is COP21 photo of the first accord where every country signed on to take action. So we have the technology. This is storage capacity increasing, and it's been increasing since then. And again, the price of silicon PV cells since 1970s to today dropped from $76 a panel to, 3 cents or something? 30 cents, sorry. It's a pretty big drop from $76 to 30 cents. We're on track. Bringing it home. Action in Oakland and the SF Bay Area. Now, I don't know everything. I think that we could, when we get the discussion session going, some of you may know more than me. But I do know that the Bay Area and California is something of an epicenter of very effective groups that people around the US and frankly around the world sometimes look to see what we're doing, how we're thinking, and how it's going. So starting with California, California is leading the way in many ways in the US. We have great legislation already in place, not only the Clean Air Act, which if you look at it, should and can and has in some cases regulated things, but really getting our vision up to date, reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. This is a great vision. We have to do even more, but it's the momentum that makes the change. You start doing some and the momentum comes. And this is in all different areas. 50% renewable energy is a goal, 50% reduction in petroleum from cars. And these, again, if you look at these different areas, they're all ways that you can get both personally and politically engaged if you so choose. So doubling energy efficiency savings in existing buildings, carbon sequestration at the land base. Yes, planting trees does matter. Reducing short-lived climate pollutants, and planning for whole regions, including all of their peoples. So the next one gives me tremendous hope. This is one of my favorite people in the world, is Stanford professor Mark Jacobson. Shows that some white guys can do good stuff, to get that in there. And he just does amazing science. He works extremely hard. He's published 130 peer-reviewed papers, and he is proving to us that his plan is 100% California by 2050. He shows that we can go 100% renewable, 100%, forget 2100, by 2050. We have to sort of ratchet the goals back towards us. And that includes a whole mix of things. Residential rooftops 7.5%, solar PV 26%, enhancing wind 25%, offshore wind 10%. If we use a mix of things and we this is the way we're going to find out. And a very inspiring part of it is that, for all this discourse from a lot of very scared, moguls of the past, very rich moguls who are, shaking in their boots a little bit, who like to say, oh, this pipeline's going to create a gazillion jobs. Everyone knows a pipeline does not create a gazillion jobs. I can't give you that, it's a technical number, a gazillion, but I don't know exactly. But we know it doesn't really create a gazillion jobs. But this, if just duck your head for a second, is this, Jacobson's showing, thank you, that operation jobs, and these are 40-year jobs. These are jobs that will endure for 40 years, give someone a whole career. Operation jobs, just here in California, 140,000. Construction jobs that will last for 40 years, okay? 300,000. So there is the data and the possibility on this Green New Deal. So what can we do? We can build community. To me, it's a lot of fun. When you sit in your own house, you can get a little sad sometimes. And, there's a lot of great people in the Bay Area. Why not? Now that we've got Agent Orange and his team, we really calls for mass cooperations. We had the lesson from Occupy to think in terms of the 99% and remember how powerful we are. Being in a coalition doesn't mean being best friends. All it means is cooperating. And as a lot of climate people are saying, the number one thing, Tom Anastasiou, who's been very involved in climate justice for 20 years, says, we need a very high cooperation world. And I think the vast majority of people want that. So get involved in some concrete ways, the ones that interest you, that seem accessible, that work, think about how the groups in the Bay Area, a lot of them are working on some of these big systemic, cyclical, and we can tap in and we can get directly involved. So work with big groups, focus on systemic cycles. Divest is one of them. It's kind of accessible, and it's been tremendously important in recent years. But that's just one example. Family, personal, yes, the personal part does matter some. You can think about, local staycations or local vacations, and think about where your power comes from, maybe get an electric car, bicycle, all those sorts of things matter too. What you eat matters, and I don't know if I should admit this in this room, but I do have a hamburger a couple times a year. You don't have to, but it is way more environmentally disastrous, way more. And an example I think is good is I think it's a pound of lentils or a pound of beef. The amount of energy and water, energy for transport, if you break down all the different dimensions of it, it's astronomically higher. And that's true for meats across the board. Lamb is actually by far the worst, and beef is terrible, chicken, etc. So if you want to conserve on your emissions, food is a very direct way. If people sponsor Meatless Mondays, we could think about how even if you're from a culture or heritage where you're used to eating meat 5 times a week, think about even reducing to 3 or 2 or 1. Think about that percentage. It's already a big percentage. It's a big difference. And personally, as a scholar, someone who loves ideas, I think the data diet is really important. So I recommend every once in a while doing an info cleanse. We cleanse our organs. Why not cleanse our soul, right? So reduce bad news by 90%. It's not that hard because there's a whole lot of bad news out there. Link to maybe inspiring updates. I like this website called Good News, and it's the first one that comes up is sort of like this Bible Belt one. It's not that one. The second one that comes up is like inspiring stories, good news that will make you smile. And some of them are like, homeless man saves a puppy sort of thing. But there are, I personally really like those, but there are also stories. I checked in just one day last summer. It was this horrible week when it was like Brexit and terrorist attacks and all these things were happening. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go look at the inspirational news site. And I went to my Good News website, and it was all these incredible, big, great stories. One of them was, the first solar airplane makes a flight around the world with 0 emissions. And, no one was hearing this. So this is a very enjoyable, pleasant way to go on your data diet. make a couple of intersectional climate justice and action websites ones that you go to. If I'm right, and I think I am, that this issue impacts all of us, that we're all going to see a meter sea level rise in our lifetime, and many, many other things. We're already seeing, things that we can't even fathom, 1 million people drowning in the Mediterranean every year. If you get proactive information about these things, you feel less disempowered. You actually can feel empowered, right? And to some extent, for some people, maybe not in this room, maybe this is the preaching to the choir, but you see these statistics about people watching screens 7 hours a day or something. And it's very easy. I was actually, for a little while, a few years ago, I think I got a little bit addicted to YouTube videos. It was like, and I would watch cool stuff, but, and I finally realized, I could spend a little bit less time, because I already know a lot about this stuff, and just shift to being with other people. The economist David McKay has a couple helpful reminders. He says, this is, for me, a picture looking at human evolution. Have no illusions. To achieve our goal of getting off fossil fuel, these reductions in demand and increases in supply must be big. Sometimes, the myth that every little bit helps is a distraction. In this case, it can be a very deadly distraction, because if everybody does a little bit, then we'll get a little bit. These are not little issues. And it's the same, the way I like to think of it, it's the same for our coalitions. If we do a little bit of coalition building, it's a good thing. But if we really start to drive down deeper into that message that, as Bernice Johnson Reagan said, if you like everybody in the room, the coalition is definitely not big enough, and I like a lot of people. So if everyone is separate, we can't coordinate across all these scales. So especially when the messages and the discourse and some of the mainstream sources are getting worse, because remember, just those few people who think they have so much to lose are creating this very negative media. Remember, you have the vast majority of humanity with you. And lastly, the founder, after it was actually founded by 7 college students, right? But the great catalyzer, Bill McKibben, who points out about Bay Area 350, very few people can say what I'm doing right now is the most important thing I could possibly be doing. I think again, it's linking the personal to the political to the planetary. There's some things that are more important for us personally, but at a planetary level, I truly can't think of anything more important than getting involved and learning more and getting engaged. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions, comments.